right, so today we're looking at part 8 of this second half of our Divine Desire series. We're calling this week's sermon The Unfinished Story, a call to grace. So if you were here last week, then you know we explored the parable of the lost son, which is really the parable of the father who lost two sons. And then from there, the parable of two lost sons. Not just one lost son, but two. But we looked primarily at the younger son and his rebellion, his repentance, and then his restoration. We also explored the heart of the father that is revealed in the predicament of lostness, in both the predicament of the younger son and the older son's lostness. But we couldn't completely wrap this consideration, we could say, up because the older brother's story sort of has its own message, and I wanted to leave enough time for us to focus on that aspect to complete this sort of two-part parable today. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to jump right into our text this morning, which is Luke 15. We're going to begin in verse 25, which is really just jumping right in to the older brother's narrative, and look at that. So we read, "Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of his servants, or one of the servants, and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come home,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could go celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him?' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" So the older brother, and we talked about this last week, so for some of you, you'll go, "Yeah, heard it." Others, you'll go, "I wasn't here," so this is sort of bringing you up to speed. But as we pointed out last week, the older brother is every bit as lost as the younger brother was. The difference between the two is that the older brother is lost while still at home. And as we pointed out last week, this is still a problem for many who would consider themselves followers of Jesus today. We talked about how most of us are not in a season of waywardness right now, where we're running in rebellion and squandering all the good things God has given us. I mean, we're all sitting here in church this morning. And so we're not in that wayward state. But for most Christians then, our struggle is not with waywardness, it is actually with being lost well, still in relationship with the Father, lost at home. So I shared a Henry Nouwen quote last week to help us understand this truth that we may be lost sons while still at home. So I'm going to show it again to refresh the memories of those who are here, but also to help those of you who weren't here to see that this may in fact be a struggle for more of us than we realize. So Nouwen said this. He said, "There are many elder sons and elder daughters who are lost while still at home. And it is this lostness characterized. So what would it look like to be lost while at home? Characterized by judgment, condemnation, anger, and resentment, bitterness, and jealousy that is so pernicious and so damaging to the human heart. Often we think about lostness in terms of actions that are quite visible. The lostness of the elder son is much harder to identify. A dark power erupts in him and boils to the surface. Suddenly there becomes glaringly visible a resentful, proud, unkind, selfish person. Lost while at home. The question then for us is, what do we do about this? And I confess that is far easier to ask than it is to do, let alone even understand what the way forward is. You see, one of the challenges of the older brother's story is that it's unfinished. Jesus doesn't tell us what happens. He leaves the story open-ended. The younger son comes home, he's invited in, the party goes forward. But for the older brother, we don't know what he does next. Does he go inside? Does he reconcile with his brother? Does he join the feast? We never find out. And if you're the type of person who feels crazy when you're watching a movie and it doesn't conclude with everything explained and reconciled and tied up pretty in a bow, then this story may in fact be a little bit frustrating for you. Because we naturally wonder, what are we supposed to do with this, Jesus? What do we do with this character that many of us relate to, and yet he seems to have no resolution to his story? Jesus, of course, is the master teacher, and so this isn't an oversight or an accident. Jesus does this on purpose. And before we can apply it to our lives, we need to look at the original audience. This is a great thing to remember. You've probably heard me say it before, but I'll say it again. Remember, church, that the Bible is for you, but it was not written to you. It was written to an original audience. These words and stories were told to original people. We are the benefactors. We enjoy it, yes, today, but this, in fact, was not written to Zach. It was written to other people. And so we need to go back to the people Jesus told this story to and consider maybe what they would have done when Jesus finished without putting a pretty bow on this. So who did Jesus tell this story to, and why did he tell it? Luke 15, right at the beginning, tells us. It says, the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Then Jesus told them this parable. Jesus told this parable first, not to people sitting in church on Sunday, but to Pharisees and teachers of the law, the holiness police, the hall monitors, the ones who were so convinced that every single drop of the law had to be preserved, and in fact even almost added to, as they built fences around the law. And the question then is, why? This is what they're after. This is what they want to know. Why, Jesus? Why do you do this? Why? Why did Jesus associate with tax collectors and sinners? Why did Jesus find himself so comfortable with societal losers? They want to know. And their question is an easy one for us to answer because we know of God's divine desire and we know how this story ends and we know what God was up to, but at this point they don't know. And so though it's easy for us to go, oh, we get why, we do need to, I think, be honest that we still to this day, in fact, ask very similar questions. Maybe the context is different. Maybe we don't say, why does God hang out with wretched people? But I do think we have asked this question, God, why do you do it that way? God, why? Why when I do you? And for the original audience, Jesus chose to leave this story unfinished. And for those times when we ask the question, why, God? Why do you do it that way? Why do you call that good? Why do you call that acceptable? We often find that there's no quick answer for our questions of why either. And sometimes the way home, even when already at home, is a journey back to the Father. So why does Jesus leave the story unfinished? What is he doing? What was he saying through that unfinished action? The reason Jesus doesn't finish the story is because he is inviting his listeners, the Pharisees and the religious elite, and now us, to finish it ourselves. What do we do with that story? But before we can finish it for ourselves here today in our own context, we probably need to review the details of the story. What do we know happened so that we can finish it? So we're going to do that. Hopefully that's helpful, especially if you weren't here last week. So the older brother, we can call this a different kind of lost. The lostness of being at home and yet still so far away. So when we first are introduced to this older brother, he's in the field. That's verse 25. And the detail might seem insignificant. Well, of course, this is an agrarian society. He's just out doing work. Everyone was doing work in the field in those days. But this actually carries a deeper meaning. What Jesus is doing here is he is telling us that the younger son who was lost in a far country was lost in one way. His lostness is obvious. But this older brother, his lostness is hidden beneath years of doing the right thing out of duty and obedience. He's doing the right thing for years for the wrong reason. Outwardly, he was exactly where he was supposed to be, working and meeting all of the expectations. But inwardly, he is just as distant from the Father as his younger brother had been. And so when he hears the music and he hears the dancing, he doesn't run inside to celebrate with everyone else. He doesn't even go to his father. He stops and he calls over a servant and asks him, what is going on? And that moment tells us everything. You see, the house is full of joy, but his first instinct is suspicion. He's suspicious of celebration. He's suspicious of joy. He's suspicious of it going well for others. And so again, we ask why? How come? It seems that his joyless heart found isolation safer than the risks of participating in the community where it might be exposed or invited to change. And so the servant explains to him, he says, your brother has come. Your father's killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. And that expression, safe and sound, in the original language means more than just physical well-being. It means more than he's okay and he's cleaned up. It actually means restoration. It means healing. It even means salvation. Safe and sound is he is restored. He has been saved. He who was once dead is alive. And that news stops the older brother in his tracks. And his response to that testimony is anger. And he refuses to go in. And for those of us desiring to learn from Jesus, then, we want to ask another question. Why won't the older brother celebrate? You see, the older son's reaction reveals what was in his heart the whole time. This isn't a new development. This is the kind of thing that in our hearts is a long time coming. We usually work on these responses and rehearse them for decades. So here are some reasons that the son can't celebrate. First of all, he sees himself as a servant, not a son. All these years I've been slaving for you and I've never disobeyed your orders. You love me, or you should love me, because I've been slaving for you. And I've never disobeyed your orders. The son, the older son, believes that his worth comes from the performance, not simply because his father loves him. Next, he has a hard time celebrating because he sees his brother as an enemy, or at least competition, not his family. He says to his father in verse 30, this son of yours. He doesn't say my brother. The father has to remind him, this brother of yours, verse 32. But the older son refuses to acknowledge the relationship. Church, there are massive takeaways for the family of God in these very simple considerations. Number 3, this is one I suspect will resonate with all of us if you're a human being. He struggles to celebrate because he sees the father as unfair. You never gave me even a goat so I could celebrate with my friends, he says in verse 29. And the irony is that the father responds saying, "My son, you're always with me and everything I have is yours." It's sort of like saying, "Why didn't you just go help yourself? It was there for you. Why didn't you think that you could have one?" The older son has access to everything the father has, but he doesn't believe it. Finally, he struggles to celebrate because all of those things lead to a fairly contaminated heart, where now what happens is the older son is experiencing sorrow at another's good. He's not just bitter, he's experiencing something that the early church called acedia, which now might be defined as like apathy. But in those days, it actually meant to have sorrow at a spiritual good. He is sorrowful at the spiritual renewal that is taking place. That's a pretty hard heart. That's a pretty cold love. He's not just angry that his brother receives grace, he resents the very joy that the father has found by the reception of this wayward son. And that's the great tragedy of the older brother. His father is pleading with him to come inside. His father wants him at the feast, but he won't come. Not because he feels he doesn't deserve it. In fact, I think there's some evidence to say he thinks he deserves it very much. But because he feels he's above celebrating the restoration of a sinful person. And the good news for this self-righteous son, imprisoned in his self-pity and his justifications for his self-pity, the "I have good reasons to feel this way" stuff, and then the subsequent bitterness and resentment, is that the grace that restores, inviting him, come inside, you should come inside, you should come inside. And then he says something incredibly powerful to that stubborn older son. He says, "We had to celebrate and be glad. We had to. This brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And that phrase, "we had to celebrate," tells us that it was necessary. Celebration was not optional. This is actually a divine imperative. It is a commandment that when grace saves, celebration is the result. It is the law of the Father's love. Celebration is commanded. God's kingdom is a kingdom of joy. Jesus says elsewhere in this chapter in verse 7 and 10, he tells us that when the lost are found, heaven itself rejoices. And yet the image bearers of God will stand on the outside and scoff. Well, heaven's busy living it up. Heaven celebrates. The question is, will we? And so Jesus told this parable to the Pharisees, to the very ones who resented his table fellowship with tax collectors and sinners. And he told them this story because this story was about them. But if we're honest, at times this story is about us too. And the challenge of this parable is not whether we will believe in saving grace for ourselves. It's whether we can rejoice in grace for others and accept the ways of God the Father in a world that we didn't create and that we are not in control of. I'll say that again. The challenge is not whether we believe in saving grace. You're in church. I suspect you believe in saving grace. It's whether we can rejoice in grace for others and accept the ways of God the Father in a world that we didn't create and we are not in control of. So we can ask some practical questions that are probably more specific to this story, like, can we welcome the lost without resentment? Can we celebrate God's goodness in the lives of even our enemies? Even when it feels unfair? can we come inside and join the feast even if we were once angry and resentful to the one who is now on the inside? And I think that for most of us, the answer to those questions would be, well, I want to. I hope I do. But then we might follow it up with, but how? Because the older brother's story doesn't end, so I still don't know how he got around this. And so this is my simple interpretation of what we do with this unfinished story. If you feel convicted that perhaps you are the older son and you don't know what to do, start right where you are. Because the older son in us reveals himself in many contexts beyond feeling frustrated about sinners being saved. In fact, you might even be fine with sinners being saved. You might go, yeah, that's great, I'm all for that. But the older son in you is critical and judgmental about all sorts of other things. And asking God why he doesn't do it your way may be a consistent conversation in your heart and mind every single day. Older son symptoms vary. And as I've said, are usually a long time in development. And so in your context, in your world, in your Sunday afternoon, you may find that you struggle to always be right. You know that there's actually like an addiction to being right, which is why people will argue over which one has the right position, that we are addicted to feeling right. Maybe you always need to understand something before you can accept something, and in the life of faith, that's obviously really challenging because we don't get to understand everything before we accept it. Maybe it's something as simple as you have an anger problem. You blow up. Maybe you're a grudge holder. Maybe you don't forgive easily. Maybe you're held by fear and you're just overrun with anxiety. Maybe you're bossy and you have to be in charge all the time or have the final word. Maybe you are consistent in your feelings of envy and jealousy towards the world and other people and people that you don't think should be ahead of you or getting something you don't have. And then you criticize and you judge what they do have. Maybe you give people one chance, but if they fail, you never trust them again. And you're proud of it. And then you try to control them. That is, of course, if you haven't cut them off. But the point is Jesus does not give one quick, one-size-fits-all prescription for the cure of self-righteousness. Because we arrive at self-righteousness by different paths. It's self-righteousness, and we are unique selves. And so the way that I might deem that I am righteous within myself is going to be different from the ways you deem you are righteous within yourself. And the only way to come home from the lostness that is self-righteousness is to see God's grace for us as something that will change us into not the best version of ourselves, the image of Jesus, who is the perfect representation of who? The Father. You see, the son, both sons are invited in. One goes in happily. The older son's also invited in, but he knows that going into the Father's house meant going into the Father's love and going into the Father's mercy and going into the Father's grace. And that was going to change him. That he would have to become like the Father to begin to celebrate and delight in the Father's joy. And the good news for all of us is that God does not ask the older brother then or today to clean up before he says, come inside. But he does promise that if you will accept his invitation, then grace will begin to change you. This son can't go in the way he was. He has to have a change, a transformation that's going to take place where he lives in the culture of God's house, in the family dynamic, in the joy of that place. And I almost feel badly for those of us that love black and white, because this is not a black and white solution. It's not just do this or don't do that. This is not a prescription. This is not a policy that if I just follow 3.1, 2, and 3, then self-righteousness is taken care of. This is not a quick fix. Paul says in Philippians 3:9, he says this, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, in other words, doing all the right things, he says, but a righteousness that which is through faith in Christ. The righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. I don't have a righteousness of my own, is what Paul says. But a righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. And so that is personal. And it begins right where we are. And many of us, as I've said, are okay with sinners finding grace, but that doesn't mean we don't express self-righteousness elsewhere that leads to being lost while at home. And so when I say start where you are, look at your closest relationships and start there. Like, you don't need to turn this into some massive biblical, theological exposition. Start where you are. Look at your closest relationships, your parents, your brothers, your sisters, your father, your mother. Look at your best friend. Look at a former church sibling. Maybe you're self-righteous with your spouse. Maybe at home there's a culture of what Paul says in 2 Timothy 3, the appearance of godliness but denying its power. But denial of power, as Paul goes on to say, the always learning but never coming to a knowledge of the truth. Paul says about those people we should avoid them. And at times I think I am one. But what I'm getting at is start with your closest relationships. If you will actually do the work of identifying the root system of self-righteousness and working on it in your most immediate context, then the older brother gets exposed and he gets invited to come home and he gets to make the decision on if that's worth pursuing or not. But on the other hand, if you're waiting for some silver magic bullet, one just quick general prayer that solves the problem and you're never self-righteous again, that's probably a myth you'll pursue for the rest of your life. There is no prayer we can pray quickly here today that's going to cure us for Sunday afternoon. Grace has to meet you where you are. It has to meet you in the field. It has to meet you in the context of who you love and who your life touches today. Grace will always empower us to be honest about God and about ourselves. And it will empower us to change. Grace doesn't just save us, it changes us. It gives us the power to live every day as followers of Jesus. But we have to see the problem first. And we never know if the older son came to see it. He knew the invitation, but we don't know if he ever agreed that it was worth accepting. And so my prayer is that this story would then inspire us to finish our own lives well and not worry so much about whether the older son did or didn't. Who cares? The point is, Jesus told this to Pharisees and teachers of the law. And he let it hang out with them. And they had to process it. They had to consider it for themselves. And so do we. So here's your sermon in a sentence for today. The older brother's story is unfinished because Jesus invites us to decide, will we join the feast? So this morning we're going to gather around some tables of food and fellowship. And I think that one of the great things about Christian fellowship, particularly around the table, is that it always becomes this small but real reflection of the kind of community Jesus invites us to be part of. It's a people who eat together, who celebrate together, who extend grace that we have received to one another, knowing that we don't have a righteousness within ourselves, but a righteousness that came by faith, a righteousness of God. And so, just as Paul said, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes when we take communion. We proclaim an ethic of the community of God when we sit and have table fellowship with other sinners, undeserving and yet saved.